This is our third lecture on early Cold War America, and we're focusing on the impact of the Cold War and domestic policies in the United States in this time around. So the Americans, particularly with how things are going in the late 1940s in around the world, begin to have an increased fear of communist influence back at home within the United States. And that leads to the Loyalty Review Board. In March of 1947, by executive order, Truman sets up the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, which includes the Loyalty Review Board. What its purpose was to investigate government employees and dismiss those found disloyal to the United States. How did they find out if they were disloyal? Mostly if they had any sort of communist influences or belonged to the Communist Party or had any very left-leaning um, ideas and political aspirations. From 1947 to 1941, the program was in place, and the Loyalty Review Board investigated over 3.2 million employees of the federal government. They only ended up dismissing 212 as security risks, and 2,900 federal employees resigned rather than be investigated. And again, we can mark this down as another kind of expansion of the federal government into private lives of American citizens. And again, looking at the ways of how civil rights have been curtailed here in the United States, where just because you have different political aspirations than or different political leanings than what the government wants you to have or thinks you should have, doesn't mean you should be dismissed or do anything or makes you any less loyal to the United States of America. The review board sets up, people are brought in front of the board, asked a whole bunch of questions, and again, questioning their loyalty to the United States and trying to root out any communist influence there. This also leads to what's called the HUAC Committee or the House Un-American Activities Committee. And what HUAC did was try to investigate communist influences in the movie industry. Uh, People higher up in the federal government believed that movies were kind of being the most consumed form of public entertainment, and they were concerned that there were too many leftist or communist messages kind of being subliminally or superliminally added into the movies in order to be able to kind of convert people to communism. So they wanted to find out and root these out in the music, right? Again, trying to figure out there's communist sneaking any sort of communist propaganda into American films very sneakily, trying to brainwash kids and women and Americans. Over 43 witnesses from Hollywood were called up in front of the HUAC committee, including famous movie stars and famous directors and famous writers of the time period. And out of this, movie executives instituted what was called the blacklist. And this was a list of people condemned for their communist backgrounds and people who were kind of took political stances or refused to go in front of their, or refused to, more importantly, name names was the big thing that came out of there. Were you willing to go up there and be able to kind of name uh, lists of communists from there that are brought in front of the board. So again, these are pretty famous hearings. These are broadcast all around the United States. Certain people, like a young Richard Nixon, is going to make a big name for himself investigating these communists in these committees. And again, they're bringing important people like Gary Cooper in front of there to testify. Other famous stars include Ronald Reagan, the movie actor, is brought in front, and he's one of the few people who's willing to name names in front of there. We're going to show you a video clip here of the famous writer Dalton Trumbo, who's going to write Spartacus, is one of the big things from here. And he's going to be one of the more hostile witnesses questioning the committee and what their actual true purpose is.
You state your full name.
Dalton Trumbo.
When and where were you born, Mr. Trumbo?
I was born in Montrose, Colorado on December 9th, 1905.
What is your occupation?
My occupation is that of a writer.
I have some other questions, Mr. Trumbo, I'd like to ask you. Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
Mr. Stribling, you must have some reason for asking me this question.
You can address the
You
committee.
do. I understand that members of the press have been given an alleged Communist Party card belonging to me. Is that true?
No, that's not.
You're not asking the question.
I was.
The chief investigator's asking the
I beg your
question.
pardon,
Now,
sir.
are you or have you ever been a member?
So hopefully you start to see the kind of antagonism that was pretty apparent in some of the investigations into all communist leanings. Uh, these investigations are kind of deemed as necessary for some breaking revelations of actual true communist infiltration within the nation. And there's a few spy cases that really stunned the United States with kind of their the all the important stuff there. One is the Elder Hiss case. He was accused of spying for the Soviets. And the that accusation really doesn't fly, but he is convicted for perjury, lying under oath during court. And the representative from California, a young Richard Nixon, is really going to gain a lot of fame in the late 40s, early 50s for really pursuing these charges against Hiss for selling secrets, particularly in the atomic bomb and nuclear research program, to the Soviets. Another group spy case was in 1950. Klaus Fuchs actually admits to giving Soviet information on the atomic bomb. He was one of the major physicists who was working in Los Alamos to develop the atomic bomb, and he admits to doing this. And along with Fuchs, Ethel, and Julius Rosenberg, who kind of are implicated along with them, they're kind of the ones who are accused of being like the middleman between Fuchs and the kind of Soviet representative in the United States. They refuse to answer any questions. They take their Fifth Amendment rights, which allows them to not self-implicate, and so they don't offer much of a defense from there. And so, unfortunately, they're then found guilty and actually electrocuted. And the electrocution of Ethel Rosenberg, Julius's wife, is really kind of a major stage with showing that the United States is willing to put a woman to the electric chair for all this stuff. And so again, that's Nixon there accusing Hiss. There was again that there were supposedly like pumpkins hollowed out that they were passing messages and doing other spy craft with, which comes from there. And again, he's hauled in front of the courts to again blame that. The Rosenbergs are another one who again are executed for spying for that. Another attempt to root out communism in the federal government and in the United States was done by McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, who lends the name of what's going to be called McCarthyism from there. Joseph McCarthy himself is a very ineffective Republican senator from Wisconsin. He's in the early 1950s up for re-election, and he realizes he really really done anything as a senator. He has nothing to go back to Wisconsin and be able to say, "Hey, I did this, I did that," and campaign on. And so he says to himself, "I got to pick an issue. How am I going to get myself reelected? How am I going to get a name for himself?" And so he decides on taking advantage of people's fears on communism. And so he begins making one unsupported, and this is a key thing, unsupported claim after another, attacking suspected communists within the government. And these accusations without evidence give the term McCarthyism, where basically he was standing up and grandstanding in the Senate and committees saying he has this secret list of communists of all these communists in the State Department, and he has this secret list of Democrats who are responsible for allowing these communists to infiltrate the government. Again, piggybacking on Republican claims that the Democrats were the reason why China went over to communism. The Democrats were the reason why the Soviets have the atomic bomb. And so he's standing up there, he's holding a piece of paper that supposedly has all these lists on there, and he's making all these claims. And basically, these are all big fat lies. He has nothing. These are all attempts in order to be able to be reelected because he really has no other options from there. So that's McCarthy in there. And again, he gets a lot of airtime on radio and in front of televisions during the news, making these accusations from there. What he does in order to be able to make a lot of these accusations, you can't just go doing this, was he very smartly only accused people in the Senate. One of the principles of the Senate is that you have legal immunity from slander in there. You can't go and sue other senators for things they said against you in the Senate. And so he uses that to keep himself from doing that. And most Republicans just kind of give him a long leash and say, yeah, go wild. because this really plays very well amongst American people of trying to root out communism within the government. And the Republicans want the Republican Party to win in 1952, so they let him go and go and go and go. What leads to McCarthy's downfall is one, he's just a pathological liar. He keeps lying and lying and lying. There's no real sense in kind of logic to any of his lies. He's also kind of a drunk. He carries a bottle of whiskey in his briefcase, and he goes from there. And then in 1954, he begins making accusations against the U.S. Army. And that's results in televised Senate hearings, of which we'll show you a clip here from a PBS document.
For over a month, McCarthy and his team exchange fire with the Army's counsel. June 9th, 1954. A lawyer for the Army, Joseph Welch, demands that McCarthy's staff release its secret list of alleged Army subversives. McCarthy responds by dredging up a past link between a young lawyer in Welch's firm and the Communist Party.
I don't think you have any conception of the danger of the Communist Party.
After years of bullying his victims, McCarthy is smug and confident. But Welch counterattacks.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman. But your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. Mr. Chairman.
Millions of Americans watch.
He was just debating, he hasn't debating.
Senator, may we not drop this? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
McCarthy's gamble, taking on the Army, backfires.
Mr. Welch here has been...
His charges don't stick. Many in his own party turn against him. 6 months later, the Senate officially censures him. His reign of terror is over, and his reputation in tatters.
So, as you can see, the tactic is gambled, backfires. The bullying that he does of these witnesses on the stands are display for all Americans. The Senate, as the clip said, censures him and condemns him, and pretty much everybody lets him go, and it leads to his downfall from it. So again, he's a big liar. He's making all these accusations. He has all these different lists. He's making all these things, but it's untrue. McCarthy almost receives this letter from Truman, where I mean he says, "I'm very sure that the people of Wisconsin are extremely sorry that they are represented by a person who has little sense of responsibility as you have. Sincerely yours, Harry S. Truman." He never actually sends this, but you could just say just how angry people within the government are because with him. So as we begin to move more into domestic policies, we see some of the adjustment and recovery that happens following the post-war world. In the United States, coming out of World War II, it's in a severe housing crisis. There's most people are living in cramped apartments in cities, or they're being forced to live with relatives, particularly GIs. We see American soldiers coming out of the war. Remember, 16 million American soldiers are within any of the auspices of the armed forces during World War II. Well, they're all coming back here in the late 1940s, and they've all got money in their pockets. They've all got jobs lined up after the war, and they've all got new wives and starting to have new families when they come back. They want to have a place of their own. And so the response to this severe housing crisis is suburbs. And the suburbanization of the United States has been going on for a long time up until this point, but it's after World War II where it really takes off with exponential growth. Suburbs are small residential communities surrounding cities. If you know the Latin, you can figure it out pretty well. Meaning urban place, sub below the urban. So these are cities kind of on the periphery. And this is where, by the 1980s, 70% of all Americans are living in a suburban area versus a urban inner city or city type atmosphere or rural out in the farms. So this really begins to take off. The major change that we see to help solve this housing crisis is done by William Levitt and his family, along with his brother and father, in Levittown. In uh, this is in Long Island. There it is. All right. What the Levitts do is they bring American kind of efficiency to the housing process, which they hadn't seen before. This is assembly line production houses using balloon frame housing. What that is basically what your house is made out of here in the United States. It's framing a house instead of kind of think of like a castle or medieval style building, big thick masonry walls on the insides and the outs or other. But this is again with all 2x4s, which it's extremely strong, extremely durable. And basically what the Levitts do is they bring a Henry Ford Model T car, but they make the Model T version of the house. And so that's what they're doing. Everything was planned out real well, and we'll show you a video clip here that explains this and how they were able to go and make at the peak of production. One house was being finished every 16 minutes for less than $7,000 at some points.
The idea that came to a man named Bill Levitt was this. Why not apply to the building of houses the same principles that have brought other American industries to their unexcelled peaks of efficiency and service? Why not mass produce the elements that go to make up a house, just as the auto industry does with the parts that go into a new car? Bill Levitt had some other ideas. Put kitchen and bathroom back to back and let them share the same plumbing. Let your plumbers do their work without interruption and without waiting for the carpenter or the bricklayer to get out of the way. Pre-cut your lumber so it's all ready to be assembled into the frame of a house. With the waste removed, one truck can deliver to the building site all the rough lumber that will go into 2 complete Levitt homes. It's really a matter of organization and planning, getting rid of waste motion. When the foundation is ready, coils for the radiant heating are there. Not a day too soon or a day too late. Without delay, the steam fitters finish their work and move on to the next house, and right behind them come the masons to lay the underflooring. Power-driven trowels make the job a lot easier and faster. Levittown houses are not prefabricated. Prefabrication means a factory operation in which large quantities of materials are kept moving to the workers. Here the opposite is true. The construction crews are moved to a waiting line of materials. This sort of organization and efficiency is all important in the vast defense housing program. That's the next order of business for the nation's home builders. The architecture of the houses in Levittown is varied enough to eliminate dreary monotony, while at the same time enough alike to permit the savings that result from standardization. Many housing projects are a sea of mud when it rains, but not this one. A wide range of color schemes also brings variety. So here's the home that cost its happy owners just $9,000. And that includes such extras as a completely equipped kitchen, a 2-way fireplace, a finished room in the attic, and even a washing machine. The living room. Levittown is a community of young people, and that means a great need for schools. Space has been set aside for plenty of them. Dotted here and there throughout the huge area are shopping centers where every type of product or service is readily available. Shoe stores, 5 and dimes, department stores.
So what the Levitts were able to do was to take a potato farm in 4,000 acres of potato farms in uh, Long Island and be able to turn it into houses. They're able to do that by again with the kind of looking for an industrial assembly line way of building houses versus what they had before. They bulldozed at the land, removed all the trees, and trucks would drop off materials at precisely 60-foot intervals. Each house was built on a concrete slab with no cellar. The floors were all asphalt, and the walls were a composition of rock board. Hand power tools like saws, routers, and nails helped increase worker productivity. Freight cars loaded with lumber went directly into a cutting yard offsite where one man would cut parts for 10 houses in one day, be able to go and drop it off. The construction process of the houses itself were divided up into 27 distinct steps, beginning with the laying of the foundation and ending with the clean sleep of the new home. Crews would go from house to house to house just to do one different job. One day the white paint man, then the red paint man, then the tile layers, and then every possible part, especially the most difficult ones, were all pre-assembled in shops. Were Instead of doing it like most builders did on site, and it was able to reduce the skilled component of these houses by about 20 to 40%. They estimated. They also were able to increase vertical integration of their firms. They were able to grow, they made their own concrete, grew their own timber, cut their own lumber, and they also bought all their appliances from wholly owned subsidiaries from companies from there. They initially opened this up just for veterans. Particularly who were living, as we said, in there. But again, they eventually opened up more there. Uh, by 1947, when they were opening up, they only allowed for the first couple of houses to be rented, and they're renting them at $60 a month. And then the after that for the first 1,800, and then a year later, they given the option to buy, but because they were made so efficiently and cheaper, the total for the mortgage, interest, principal, and taxes was less than renting the house, and so almost everybody bought all the 1949 units. Eventually, over 17,400 houses were built in Levittown and then held 82,000 residents. And it was the largest housing development ever built up by a single builder in the United States. And it was basically these houses aren't meant to be like real fancy smancy architectural wonders. They were meant to be kind of the most utilitarian way of providing shelter in a way for a family for there. Each dwelling was 12 by 16, had a 12 by 16-foot living room, had a fireplace, one bath, and two bedrooms. About 750 square feet with a lot of expansions up into the attic or out into the yard. The floor plan was very practical and well designed, particularly for young families. The kitchen was moved to the front of the house so mothers could watch their children from the kitchen windows and or do their washing cooking with a minimum movement. Similarly, the living room was moved to the back of the house with a big giant picture window to be able to look out from there. His Cape Cod style houses went for $7,990, and the ranches within Levittown went for $9,500. With him promising no down payments, no closing costs, and no hidden extras. Um, with housing programs through the FHA and then the VA, Levitt was able to boast unheard of lines of credit from a private builder, and he simplified the paperwork required for the purchase down to 2 half-hour steps for families in order to be able to do that. He also, with his advertisements, would throw in China things to induce stuff, including a Bendix washer, and then also an 8-inch television set that families would have to go from there. How cheaply he was able to sell these houses, what's the economies of scale that he was working with. That by 1948, he undersold his nearest competition by $1,500 and was still making $1,000 profit, according to Harper's Weekly. Um, to be able to kind of improve on not just giving people a place to sleep, but also to kind of keep them there. They planted apple, cherry, and evergreen trees on each of the plots and tried to give everything much more park-like experience. They put over 9 swimming pools, 60 playgrounds, 10 baseball diamonds, and 7 village greens to provide open space and recreational opportunities for all the people from there. They built several other Levitt towns in Pennsylvania and Delaware, but the first one on Long Island is the most famous one. And again, all these families kind of begin to move in. And what did they start doing? They started having little babies on themselves. It was called Fertility Valley and the Rabbit Hutch in some of these suburbs because of how many people are having babies all the time. And this kind of gives you the idea of what becomes like 1950s America. So this is Levittown from the air. As you can see just how wide and expansive it is. And this is, again, just one example of suburbs like Schaumburg, like you're looking at here, that are popping up and going in all around the United States, particularly around the major cities. What we see after the World War is that economists are fearing a lot of post World War II depression. What we've seen out of every war America's fought in is that there's a depression in the economy as we move out of the war setting of the economy and into a peacetime setting. However, the economists are shocked that out of the World War II, the economy actually grows. So the question becomes, why is there no post-World War II depression? Why does the American economy actually increase instead of decreasing like we've seen? So what is the answer to this? Well, first off, Americans saved over $135 billion during World War II, mostly through the buying of war bonds. And so for a lot of people, this is the first time they've been able to squirrel away a lot of money. Remember, a lot of people are making a heck of a lot of money in defense contracts or through the army or in other ways from World War II, and so now they've got money saved up from there. Once they've saved it up, Americans now want the things that they had to do without during the war because they were either fighting overseas or they were waiting for their husbands to come back or they were making other adjustments or was being rationed during the war. So because Americans want all those things and they have the money to buy with them, manufacturing actually increases in order to supply the Americans with this. Cold War also it, uh, it has its increases on and it's keeping this going because the federal government is still spending a whole heck of a lot of money to help fuel the economy. There's a whole heck of a lot of defense spending. Think about the NSC 68 document, and the Marshall Plan is also kicking into high gear, and you have all that money being spent to provide stuff and paying Americans to help rebuild all of Europe. So what we begin to see is again is that with these war bonds and other stuff, people can make a heck of a lot of money. In terms of some other challenges that are going on during following World War II, we see some labor challenges. In 1946, 4.5 million workers go on strike. They fear that the wages are going to go down, the hours are going to be cut or gotten rid of as the war ends. And what Truman does to get them to go back to work is threatens to draft them and say, "Hey, I'm going to send you back to work," and order them as soldiers to go to work, and they decide we'll go back to work. We don't want to be drafted in the army. In terms of social challenges from this, Truman is actually a big supporter of civil rights, which kind of goes against some of his early kind of dealings with trying to with rural politics in Kansas City. It's kind of the stuff that goes out of there, and he tries to pass several laws in order to support civil rights and African Americans in particular throughout the United States. But as we've seen typically again and again and again, Southern Democrats block his ability in order to be able to support the civil rights. So Truman turns to executive power in order to be able to get these things passed. The major thing that he does to show his support of civil rights is that in 1948 he desegregates the armed forces. For the first time in American history, African American and other American soldiers are allowed to serve in the same units, and African Americans are given more opportunity to rise up within the ranks of the army. So that's a major thing. Truman also ends discrimination in hiring government employees, and he also goes and creates the President's Commission on Civil Rights in order to be able to gather more information about how best the federal government and Harry Truman and what the civil rights picture is looking like in 1948. And so that's what he does to be able to do that. Harry Truman is one of the first presidents here while in office to address members of the National Association of Colored People, the NAACP. And again, the segregation in the armed forces is a major civil rights step that Truman does by executive order because he can't do it through legislation because Southern Democrats kept doing that. So it's within this atmosphere that the 1948 presidential election is going. The Democrats themselves are fractured over fiscal issues within the government, spending on government programs, and also containment issues and communism around the world, and also social problems. The Southern Democrats, the Southern wing of the Democrats who want segregation and hate giving civil rights to African Americans, don't like Truman doing all this stuff. So the Democrats are fractured to the point where a group led by Strom Thurmond break away, and they call themselves the Dixiecrats. And a third group of Democrats, right, forms a progressive party who wants to go back to more progressive changes with that we've seen coming out of again the progressives of the early 1900s. So Truman itself is kind of facing a pretty big step within his own problems within his own party as 1948 turns. The Republicans turn to the governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey, and he takes a lot of popular campaign promises across the nation. And what how bad the situation is in 1948 for the Democrats is that Dewey believes once the Republicans pick him, this is going to be a cakewalk, and everybody has pretty much already written Truman off as kind of an afterthought. There's no possible way he can do that, and so Dewey is predicted to win on election day, going back all the way to like August of 1948. That everybody's already predicting a landslide Dewey victory. And so what Truman does is he's got to be able to try to figure out a way to go and do this. And so throughout the summer of 1948 into the fall, he goes on an amazing whistle stop tour around the nation. When he gets on one train where he's speaking at several different cities every single day and giving kind of speeches from the back of a train car. At one point, a farmer says, "Hey Harry, good luck. Try your best." And he says, "I'm going to give him hell." And so reporters overhearing that, and this is the famous "Give Him Hell, Harry" campaign of 1948, where basically he goes around the country and does this, and he pulls off one of the great political upsets in American political history, and particularly presidential history. Now, as a side jot, we talk a lot more of this in class because this is pretty interesting stuff. Truman moves into the White House, and this is a building that's falling apart that hasn't seen any major renovations since before the Civil War. And so he basically looks at this and he gets Congress to basically gut the inside of the building. And so the White House turns from a antebellum era mansion into the kind of building, the modern building with civil defense stuff underneath it, with office space and all the different things to run the executive branch with living quarters in the second floor. And so he basically guts the whole thing and he goes and redoes that in order to be able to kind of make it livable from there. And so basically, the facade is the only thing left standing where they go and they pretty much gut the whole inside. So he goes on this. Truman, famous for that. He's also a pretty likable guy for most parts. He's a pretty avid poker player, and so he has a lot of poker games from there. And so it's the governor of New York, Thomas E. Dewey, that goes and runs against him. And even on election day, as the first 11 states call the election for Dewey, the very conservative leader of the Chicago Tribune, uh, Colonel Robert McCormick, actually goes and runs this headline of Dewey defeats Truman, and it's only in the after hours or in the wee mornings of the next day that it's actually Truman wins, and that gives one of the most famous pictures of the 20th century. Dewey defeats Truman, where Truman's holding up the headline in the newspaper that says he actually lost. As we move out of the 48 election into 1952, the presidential election is in the thing going under with the Korean War happening. McCarthyism really sinks and bites into Truman's and the Democrats' approval rating, and the Cold War setbacks that we've seen from the uh, to the Soviets really hurts the Democrats. And so the Democrats run the governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, and the Republicans turn to Dwight D. Eisenhower, if you remember, the famous general from World War II. America, Eisenhower runs a famous campaign of like Ike, and so America likes him a very lot, although questions are raised over campaign finances and possible financial violations of the vice president that Eisenhower picks of Richard Nixon, from there. During the 1950s, Ike himself as a political candidate is very popular. He's a war hero. He's very liberal on, he's not very liberal, he's more liberal on social issues, and he's conservative on financial issues, which the people of the United States like. And there's not a whole lot of executive problems that Eisenhower runs into from there. He's anti-communist, which again helps with having Nixon on the ticket, and he's also a very famous golfer. Really loves golfing, and so he does able to do trick shots like this off the guy's forehead from there. So he's a pretty likable candidate. He goes from there, and famously, he makes a promise on the campaign trail that if he's elected, he's going to go to Korea and figure out what's going on there while president, and then he lives up to that promise. And again, he's one of the people that helps push towards again a resolution of the conflict. And so that's we'll leave this story, and we'll pick this up with some more things that are happening in the 1950s in our next time.